So you sent us this incredible stack of sources today, and looking through your notes, we are diving into a paradox that really it completely upends how most of us understand American history.
Oh, yeah, it really does.
Because, when you hear the name Karl Marx, you probably think of the ultimate antithesis of the American dream.
Right, you think of the Cold War.
Exactly. The Cold War, Soviet regimes, an ideology that feels entirely alien to the land of free enterprise. But our mission for this deep dive is to dig through your sources, which rely heavily on Andrew Hartman's book, Karl Marx in America, and answer this one kind of wild question.
Which is how the architect of communism became this massive, invisible force in shaping the United States.
Yes. And it is a phenomenal question.
It really is, because it's almost instinctual to view him purely as, the anti-American philosopher. But Hartman's book reveals a relationship that goes both ways.
Like a two-way street.
Exactly. America shaped Marxist theories just as much as Marx shaped American labor movements. So it's a completely different narrative than the one we're usually taught.
Right. And reading through your notes, it's like Marx acts almost like a ghost in the American machine.
That's a great way to put it.
He's this ever-present specter that Americans have constantly used as a sounding board. Whether they were vehemently opposing him or, marching in the streets quoting him, they were using his ideas to try and define what true freedom actually means in a capitalist society.
Yeah, but to really understand this ghost, we have to start with how Marx actually read America.
Right, and I was honestly blown away by this first detail in the sources, because in the 1850s, Marx wasn't just sitting in some dusty London library theorizing.
No, he was actually a working journalist.
For an American newspaper.
Yes, the New York Daily Tribune. And we really have to establish just how influential this paper was.
It wasn't just some small pamphlet, right?
Not at all. The Tribune wasn't some fringe radical thing. It was essentially the unofficial organ of the newly formed Republican Party, published by Horace Greeley. Yeah, it had roughly 200,000 subscribers, which made it an absolute titan of media at the time. I mean, that's double the circulation of the London Times.
That is wild. So you have the foundational thinker of communism writing hundreds of articles for a mainstream Republican American family newspaper.
Exactly.
And according to the sources, its readers likely included Abraham Lincoln.
They absolutely did. And what Marx was analyzing closer than anything else during his tenure at the Tribune was the buildup to the American Civil War.
Okay, so how did he view the conflict?
Well, he didn't just see it as a regional conflict, or a tragic division of a nation. Through his lens, it was a world historic revolution between two entirely incompatible labor systems.
Right, the slave economy of the South and the free labor economy of the North.
Precisely. He famously wrote, labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin.
Okay, but wait, let me push back on that a little bit because this is where the terminology gets tricky for me. I see in the notes that Marx compared the factory workers of Europe to the enslaved people of the American South.
He did, yeah.
How could Marx even compare a factory worker who, gets a paycheck and can theoretically quit their job to actual chattel slavery? I mean, that sounds like a massive exaggeration. How did he justify that comparison?
It's a really crucial question, and it comes down to how Marx defined autonomy.
Okay.
For Marx, slavery wasn't an isolated racist anomaly. He viewed it as the most extreme, visible end of a broader spectrum of coerced labor.
A spectrum, right.
Yeah. He argued that under capitalism, a worker who owns nothing but their own ability to work is forced to sell their time and their body to a capitalist just to survive.
And he called this wage slavery.
Exactly. He argued that the veiled slavery of the wage laborer in Europe actually needed the unqualified, brutal chattel slavery of the New World as its pedestal.
So knock out the pedestal, and the whole system of exploitation starts to shake.
Precisely. He fundamentally believed that abolishing chattel slavery was the absolute prerequisite for any future working class revolution.
Because workers couldn't unite if some of them were literally property.
Right. Workers across the globe could never unite under those conditions. This is why he was so intensely invested in a Union victory. In 1864, he even penned a congratulatory letter to Abraham Lincoln on behalf of the International Workingmen's Association.
Oh, man. And the response he got is hilarious.
It really is.
I mean, looking at the notes, Lincoln's ambassador politely answered in this incredibly dry, prosaic legalese, basically saying, thanks, but the U.S. government doesn't do unlawful interventionism.
Yeah, it's such a letdown.
It's this amazing historical mismatch of tones. Marx writes this fiery world historic declaration of working class triumph, and the American government basically replies with a polite corporate email.
Exactly. But, beneath that humorous exchange is a profound ideological collision.
How so?
Well, both Lincoln and Marx passionately hated slavery, but they had fundamentally incompatible definitions of what freedom actually meant once slavery was abolished.
Right, because Lincoln believed in free labor, this classic American bootstrap narrative.
Yeah, the idea that you start at the bottom, work hard for wages, save up, and eventually you own your own farm or shop.
You become your own boss.
Exactly. But Marx looked at the exact same system and said, no, wage labor is a trap.
A trap, because the system was rigged.
Well, Lincoln believed the system was fluid. He believed capital and labor weren't permanently locked in conflict. But Marx looked at the industrializing economy and saw a rigid structure.
Okay.
According to his theories, as long as a capitalist owned the factory and the worker only owned their labor, the worker could never be truly free.
Because freedom, for Marx, required total autonomy.
Yes, control over your own time and the fruits of your own work.
And that tension perfectly sets up the next phase of your sources. Because after the Union wins the war and slavery is abolished, Lincoln's dream of everyone owning a little farm doesn't exactly pan out for most people.
Far from it.
Instead, we crash headfirst into the Gilded Age. We get this explosive, completely unregulated growth of industrial capitalism.
Yeah, and suddenly, Marx's critique of wage slavery isn't just theoretical anymore.
Right, it's playing out in bloody color on the streets of Chicago and New York.
The late 19th century was incredibly brutal for the working class. You had rapid industrialization leading to massive wealth inequality.
And all the strikes, right?
Yeah, this is the era of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, where hundreds of thousands of workers walked off the job, and the Haymarket Riot in 1886.
People were just desperate.
Desperate and working in horrific conditions. And this is exactly when Marx publishes the first volume of his defining work, Capital.
And according to Hartman's book, The Centerpiece of Capital for American Workers was his chapter on the working day.
Yes, absolutely.
But before we get to the workers' reaction, I want to make sure we understand the mechanism here. The notes mention that Marx argued capitalism extracts maximum surplus value from workers.
Right.
Explain the math of that for me. How does surplus value actually work in this context?
Okay, so let's break it down to its simplest components. Imagine a worker in a shoe factory.
Okay, I'm with you.
In the first 4 hours of their shift, they produce enough value in shoes to cover the cost of their own daily wage.
So if they went home then, the capitalist would just break even.
Exactly.
Right.
But the capitalist owns the factory, so they dictate the hours. They force the worker to stay for 10, 12, or 14 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And all the value that worker produces in those extra hours is surplus value. It's pure profit that goes directly into the capitalist's pocket.
Got it.
Marx argued that capitalism inherently tries to stretch that working day as long as physically possible to maximize that surplus. He famously compared capital to a vampire that sucks living labor and lives the more labor it sucks.
Okay, so it's like a smartphone battery.
Oh, I like that.
Like the worker is the battery. The boss needs 40% of the charge just to keep the lights on and pay the worker enough to survive.
Right.
But the system is designed to drain the battery down to 1% every single day, just to hoard the extra power. And you can't just ask the system to stop, because draining the battery is the system.
That is a fantastic analogy, and it perfectly illustrates why Marx said capital will not let go until it has extracted every last drop.
But the American elites at the time had a completely different explanation for why the battery was being drained, right?
No, absolutely.
I'm looking at this concept in the sources called the gospel of success.
Yeah, the gospel of success.
You had famous figures like Henry Ward Beecher, who was a prominent minister, literally arguing that if a worker couldn't survive on bread and water, they simply weren't fit to live.
It's harsh.
So harsh. And President James Garfield said the best thing for a young man is to be tossed overboard to sink or swim. They were telling starving, exhausted factory workers, if you're poor, it's your own moral failure. Just work harder.
And that right there is why Marx's ideas became such a revelation for American workers. Marx provided the ultimate counter-narrative to that gospel of success.
He gave them an out.
Exactly. For a worker doing 14-hour shifts in a dangerous steel mill, Marx offered a structural explanation for their misery. He told them, look, your exhaustion isn't a personal failure.
Right.
The capitalist doesn't want you to work 14 hours because you lack moral fiber. They want you to work 14 hours because every hour past your basic survival is stolen profit.
It completely shifted the paradigm. I mean, if I'm on a treadmill and the gospel of success tells me you're falling behind, you just need to run faster, I'm going to burn out and blame myself.
Naturally, yeah.
But Marx comes along and says, look at the machine. The boss controls the speed dial, and he is mathematically incentivized to turn it up until you collapse. Running faster won't save you.
No, it won't.
The only way to survive is to step off, unionize with everyone else on the treadmills, and seize the control panel.
Exactly. It gave workers the intellectual ammunition to fight for the 8-hour workday. But seizing that control panel presented a massive logistical problem for early American socialists.
Because the texts were so hard to read.
Yeah, Marx's writings, like Capital, were incredibly dense.
Yeah.
And more importantly, they were viewed by the American public as dangerously foreign.
Right. I mean, you couldn't just hand an exhausted 19th century American rail worker a 1,000-page German economics textbook and expect a revolution.
You really couldn't.
So they had to translate it. And this brings us to section 3 of your notes, which is the Americanization of Marx.
Yes.
And this is where the strategy gets really creative. How did American intellectuals package these dense structural critiques into something that felt culturally resonant for Americans?
Well, they essentially dressed Marx up in familiar American clothing. First, they used science.
Okay, how so?
During this time, elites were using social Darwinism, the idea of survival of the fittest, to justify their immense wealth. They claimed the rich were simply biologically superior. But socialist thinkers like Lawrence Gronlund and Ernest Unterman flipped that script. They pushed what they called a socialist Darwinist view.
Wait, how does that work? How do you make Darwin socialist?
By focusing on evolution rather than brutal competition.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they argued that human society wasn't supposed to be a vicious dog-eat-dog jungle forever. Instead, they claimed society was naturally, scientifically evolving toward a higher state of equality and cooperation.
So it's just a phase.
Exactly. Capitalism wasn't the end of history. It was just an awkward, necessary phase of human evolution on the way to socialism.
That is strategically brilliant because, as your sources point out, America is deeply optimistic. It's a culture obsessed with progress and scientific advancement.
Very much so.
So by wrapping Marx in the language of evolution, they made radical class struggle palatable. It wasn't a violent disruption of the American project. It was just the scientific next step.
Right. It felt natural.
And they didn't just use science. They used fiction, which brings us to Edward Bellamy.
Yes, Edward Bellamy is a crucial figure here. In 1888, he published a utopian novel called Looking Backward.
Oh, I've heard of this.
It's about a man who falls asleep and wakes up in the year 2000 to find a perfect cooperative society where industry is nationalized and poverty is eradicated.
And it was a massive bestseller.
Huge.
But the wildest part to me, looking at your notes, is that Bellamy purposefully never used the word socialism or even mentioned Marx in the book.
Not once.
He knew the terminology would scare people off. So it was essentially a Trojan horse. He smuggled Marxist critiques of capitalism into a wildly popular sci-fi romance novel, and millions of Americans read it.
He absolutely did. And Bellamy wasn't the only author doing this. You also had Jack London.
Right, The Call of the Wild.
Yeah, most people know him for The Sled Dogs, but London was actually a deeply committed Marxist. Before he wrote about sled dogs, he wrote a dystopian novel called The Iron Heel.
What's that about?
It's practically a manifesto of Marxist theory. It explores the concept of an oligarchy violently crushing the working class. London was vital in popularizing this Marxist idea that capitalism was inherently unstable and would eventually dig its own grave.
Okay, but looking at your sources, we really have to pause on Jack London for a second.
Yeah, we do.
There's a glaring, tragic contradiction here. London was this fiery Marxist who advocated for global working-class solidarity. But his writings also reveal he was a virulent white supremacist.
Yes, he was.
He viewed the working-class struggle entirely through a racially exclusive lens. That raises a massive red flag. It highlights that adopting Marxist economics didn't automatically erase deep-seated American prejudices.
So how did the socialist movement of that era justify or deal with that contradiction?
It is a dark and really vital point raised in Hartman's book. The socialist movement of the early 20th century was deeply fractured over race.
I can imagine.
Many orthodox Marxists of the time practiced what we'd call class reductionism.
What does that mean exactly? They argued that class was the only fundamental division in society. Their logic was that racism was merely an artificial tool invented by capitalists to divide the working class.
Right.
Therefore, they believed that if you simply fix the economic system and abolish capitalism, racism would naturally evaporate on its own.
which is incredibly naive.
Incredibly.
I mean, by ignoring the specific violent realities of white supremacy, figures like London could harbor deeply racist views while still calling themselves egalitarian heroes of the working class.
Exactly.
Marx's critique of capital was a powerful tool, but clearly it wasn't a magic wand that cured America's original sin.
Precisely. And that friction brings us to how these ideas actually played out on the ground. Because this Americanized Marx didn't stay confined to utopian novels or theoretical debates.
It moved into the real world.
Yeah, it spilled out into the sweatshops, the logging camps, and the prairies, creating a massive, highly diverse, and sometimes entirely contradictory big tent of American socialism.
The big tent.
Yeah.
And the absolute center pole of that tent was Eugene V. Debs.
Yeah, Debs.
The notes highlight that he ran for president 5 times as a socialist. And his rhetoric is fascinating because he didn't sound like a Soviet operative. He blended hardcore Marxist critique with the 4th of July, with traditional American republicanism, and with evangelical Christianity.
He really did.
He literally compared Jesus to a true communist. I mean, he made class struggle sound as American as apple pie.
Debs was a master communicator. He understood that to build a mass movement, you have to speak the vernacular of the people.
Right.
And the people he was organizing were incredibly diverse. For instance, you had the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, famously known as the Wobblies.
The Wobblies, yeah.
These were hardscrabble Western miners, lumberjacks, and itinerant laborers. Their leader, Big Bill Haywood, perfectly captured their brand of visceral, experiential Marxism.
What did he say?
He famously declared, "I've never read Marx's Capital, but I have the marks of capital all over me."
I love that quote. It perfectly illustrates that you didn't need a PhD in dialectical materialism to know you're being exploited.
No, not at all.
You just had to look at your paycheck and your working conditions. But the tent was even more complex than that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Hubert Harrison, who was known as the Black Socrates.
Oh, yes.
How did he map race onto this Marxist framework differently than someone like Jack London did?
Well, Harrison was a brilliant intellectual who saw exactly what the white Orthodox socialists were missing. He used Marxist analysis to explain that capitalists weren't just passively benefiting from racism, they were actively weaponizing it.
Weaponizing it.
Yeah. Harrison showed how employers explicitly used black workers as a club to beat down the wages of white workers, and vice versa.
Oh, wow.
He argued that racism was a structural pillar of American capitalism, meaning you could never effectively fight the capitalist class without fighting white supremacy head-on.
So he took Marx's framework of structural exploitation and expanded it to include systemic racism.
Precisely.
That makes total sense. But the group in your notes that completely blew my mind, the most surprising faction in this big tent, are the Oklahoma socialists.
Oh, they're fascinating.
In the 1910s, Oklahoma had one of the strongest socialist parties in the entire country. But these weren't urban factory workers reading German philosophy. These were evangelical Christian tenant farmers.
It is one of the most fascinating anomalies in American political history.
It feels like hacking a piece of software.
Yeah.
Because historically, Marx viewed rural peasants as somewhat isolated and backward. His software was designed to run on the operating system of the industrial city.
Right.
So how on earth did rural evangelical farmers hack Marx's urban philosophy to run on a fight over Midwestern farmland?
They hacked it by looking at the underlying code, the mechanism of exploitation.
Okay.
These tenant farmers were trapped in a vicious cycle of debt to absentee landlords, banks, and railroad monopolies. They realized they were completely alienated from the fruits of their labor.
Exactly like a factory worker on an assembly line.
Exactly. So they took Marx's critique of the capitalist class, but they fused it with Thomas Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic.
So they basically said the factory boss and the absentee landlord are the exact same vampire.
Exactly. They argued that the only way to end this rural wage slavery was to redistribute the land back to the people who actually worked it.
Wow.
They read their Bibles, they read the Declaration of Independence, and they read the Communist Manifesto. And they managed to see the exact same message in all three.
Which is what?
That a greedy elite is stealing your dignity, and you have to organize to take it back.
Okay, so let's pull all of this together. For you listening to this right now, what is the ultimate takeaway from your stack of sources? Why does a 19th century German philosopher's wild ride through American history matter today?
Well, according to Hartman's analysis, the legacy of Marx in America isn't about whether he inspired a lasting socialist state here.
Because he didn't.
He didn't. The corporate forces of the 20th century, the Red Scares, the Cold War, those forces successfully beat back that political movement.
Right.
But the argument presented in your sources is that Marx's ideas became a vital tool. They provided a vocabulary for millions of Americans fighting for an 8-hour workday, for union representation, and for basic human dignity.
Hartman's book really frames it as Marx forcing the nation to look in the mirror. He forced America to confront the glaring, painful gap between our soaring ideals of freedom and the harsh mechanical realities of wage labor.
Yes, absolutely. Through Marx's lens, when an economic system treats human beings purely as commodities, as disposable lines on a spreadsheet, it fundamentally undermines the promise of a free society.
And that critique doesn't just evaporate because the Soviet Union collapsed.
No, it doesn't. As long as capitalism exists, the questions Marx raised about who controls our time, who controls our labor, and who controls our lives will remain highly relevant.
Which brings us to one final, deeply provocative thought from your sources to leave you with. There's a fascinating historical parallel mentioned in the notes between Marx and the famous American historian Frederick Jackson Turner.
Yeah, this is a great point.
Both men actually agreed on one crucial thing. The American frontier stabilized early capitalism. It acted as a giant escape valve.
Right. The theory was that if you were an angry, disenfranchised worker in a miserable factory in the East, you could theoretically pack up and head west to claim cheap land.
Right, you had options.
Yeah. The physical frontier prevented the pressure cooker of class conflict from exploding because it offered an alternative to wage labor.
But that physical frontier has been closed for over a century. And today, our modern frontiers, the digital landscape, the gig economy, the tech startups that were supposed to democratize the world, they feel increasingly enclosed and monopolized by massive corporate giants.
Very true.
There's no West left to run to.
Yeah.
So based on the history in your sources, we have to ask, are we finally trapped in the unmasked pressure cooker capitalism that Marx predicted?
Yeah.
With the escape valve permanently welded shut, how will the American worker of the future respond? Because the ghost is clearly still in the machine. And the machine is running faster than ever.
A truly fascinating question to end on.
Thanks for sending us these sources, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.